Welcome back to this week's episode of Copy That. My name's Chili D, joined by Curly behind the lens. This week's episode is episode 3. This week we have Councillor Jonathan Sri for the Gabba Ward. We'll be talking to him about politics, racism, colonialism, and a little chit-chat at the end about his past and what's in the future for him. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you like what we do, you know the drill. Like and subscribe down below for all the comments. Also, maybe send us a message on Instagram, but up to you. Catch us later. Joining me this evening is Councillor Jonathan Sri, Jono, as I shall refer to you for the rest of the interview. You are the councillor for the Gabba Ward of Brisbane City Council.
That's right. Been local councillor for like 5 years now. I'm doing pretty good, thanks.
5 years. Ooh, that's a good stint.
Yeah, I got elected back in March 2016.
2016, yeah.
And represent kind of West End, Wollongabba, Kangaroo Point, that part of the city.
KP, yeah, nice. I wanted to start out by asking a little bit about your backstory. What was the sort of catalyst for you to get into politics? Have you ever always wanted to serve?
No, I was always quite cynical of like politics and politicians, or maybe I was cynical of politicians but interested in political issues. So kind of as a young guy growing up in Brisbane, a predominantly white sort of society, was very conscious of racism and sort of, I was in like primary school the first time Pauline Hanson rocked up on the scene. And so those early experiences of being feeling a bit like an outsider in my own country politicized me a little bit and sort of got really interested in refugee rights because my dad came from Sri Lanka sort of after the Civil War broke out. Yeah. Yeah. And Mum actually worked in remote Aboriginal communities as a teacher. So we also got to see a lot of what life was like in some of those sort of pretty impoverished remote Aboriginal communities. And I think that also politicized me a little bit. And so, yeah, coming up through school, had a couple of maybe political English teachers who put me on to reading some interesting stuff and kind of then went from there. I went to uni at UQ in Brisbane and was sort of studying law and journalism with a bit of an idea of either getting into reporting and journalism or maybe like human rights law. But then, ended up getting more interested in green politics and sort of one thing led to another. And finally, I found myself running for an election. Were
there any other parties you were interested in?
No, I mean, I think by the time I was kind of in late high school, it was pretty obvious that Labor was part of the problem. Like we'd seen them sell out on climate change stuff and refugee rights and a long list of other issues. So maybe if there was another more radical party around that seemed like it had a credible chance of winning seats, I might have ended up in something even more, extreme, say. But Greens,
it's interesting you use that word radical because I just don't think the Greens are radical. I think they're actually quite logical and like policies I find very like just common sense. You know?
Totally. And
for it to be called radical it's like a way that they separate us, you know?
Yeah, and maybe I'm doing a disservice to the movement because it sort of implies that there's something wacky or out there about the ideas we're pushing. Like lots of people would say, no, this is evidence-based, this is common sense. Yeah, it's really simple stuff. But simple. I think for me, the word radical evokes this idea of wanting to change things and wanting some pretty big changes. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't necessarily mean those changes or those ideas are crazy or fiendish, but in the current context, they are a little bit unorthodox or countercultural.
In the current, exactly.
Yeah, so
right?
we've had sort of over the last 50 or 60 years a very radical shift towards neoliberalism. Like Western societies in general have become much more dominated by big corporations and arguably a lot more heavy government control and regulation. And so neoliberalism was quite radical. And now I guess we need another radical shift away from that paradigm.
Definitely. Agreed. So in preparation for this interview, I was really eager to research about a young person's understanding of politics in Australia. How do we understand the democratic system? So I read parts of Ian McAllister's Civic Education and Political Knowledge in Australia, and also more recently an article by The Conversation discussing the most recent NAP tests for civics and citizenship. So around 13,000 students take this test, and in 2019, the results show that we, like young people, aren't becoming any more informed on our democratic system, which I think is really where we should start in terms of being able to, I guess, represent what the people want. You know, if I'm not educated in a system, how am I going to be an informed voter? You know. So some of the stats, 38% of year 10 students reached the standard of knowledge on civics and citizenship required to their level, the same percentage as in 2016. And for year 6s, only 53% achieved the benchmark, which is going down from 55% in 2016. So how can we encourage young people to become more informed about politics? Obviously, because the implications for the confidence and preparedness of young people to participate in just shaping our society is really important.
Yeah, I mean, the trends we see sort of around younger demographics are actually kind of similar to other age groups where everyone is becoming more cynical, more disengaged from mainstream political discussions and has less of a robust understanding of how government works and how decisions are made. But it's particularly pronounced around like younger age groups. And I think a big part of that is that actually a lot of young people, and I'm thinking in particular like high schoolers and maybe people in their early uni years, are quite smart and can see that politicians actually don't give a crap about them. And that's I think like a lot of people, they look at the major parties, they look at the way Parliament works, and they can see that that system, like even if they don't understand it comprehensively, they understand intuitively that it's not really serving their interests. And you don't have to dig very deep to see the kinds of decisions government makes, and you can work out that, oh, they're not really looking out for young people, or they're not really looking out for me, they're looking out for the interests of big businesses. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that people are a bit disengaged. I think the challenge becomes, how do we say to people, hey, you need to pay attention to this and you need to care about politics, but you're still allowed to be cynical of it. And that's kind of a tricky, because I'm often telling people, yeah, politicians are corrupt. Yeah, the political system is broken, but you still need to pay attention to it and understand it and try to influence it where possible. And that's sort of a more nuanced message than just being like, the system is screwed, don't even bother. Because that's kind of the easy get out of jail card.
And that's not going to get us anywhere.
No. And the system loves it when young people in particular stop paying attention, and the political power structure thrives off disengagement. They keep us under control because we're disengaged. And so it's almost a deliberate way that the system's set up like that. That's the very foundation of like representative democracy, is that you vote in some people and then they do the thinking for you and you don't have to pay attention because you've elected these representatives. Whereas what I would argue we need is a more inclusive, deliberative democracy where you and I and everyone we know are actively participating in decisions.
Definitely.
Because that's representative democracy is not really inclusive or participatory. It's just like outsourcing decision making to some privileged people in positions of power. Whereas if people feel that they have meaningful control over those decisions, then of course you pay attention. Like when you know that your decision matters and what you think of something is actually going to influence the outcome, you're more likely to pay a bit more attention.
Do you think that comes down to trust?
Yeah, it's trust and empowerment, right? Like I've had experiences where a bunch of people haven't been particularly interested in, say, some local urban planning issue. But then if I go to that community and say, hey, look, I'm not going to make this decision, I'm leaving the decision up to you. Okay. The first thing those residents will start to do is ask more questions and be like, oh, well, we need this information and we need to know more about this. And then they'll start talking to each other. Yeah. And they are becoming more engaged and trusting the process. And that's partly because they've been given control over the decision. Yeah. Whereas what most politicians do most of the time is just say, I'm going to make the decision, but I still want you to write a submission or send me an email or whatever. And it's like, why should I spend all that time writing a submission or emailing my MP when I don't actually think they're going to listen to me? So I find now that with the community groups I've been more connected to, people do trust that I care what they think. And so they spend more time telling me what they think. Whereas the groups that still be like, oh, Jono doesn't care what I think, then they're not going to bother telling me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Definitely. So we need to start encouraging young people to not only trust the system, but perhaps
maybe not trust the system. I don't know if we want to encourage people to trust the current system. We want to encourage people to engage with the system, right?
Trusting it that, like, I feel like you'd be more inclined to do more if you trust something, right? Like, yeah. Like if I'm going into something having no, like the idea that it's going to work is not high, then like I'm like probably not going to do it, or I'm not going to work really hard for it.
Yeah.
Because the systems are there in place.
But like I'm a politician, and even I think the political system's corrupt. Like that's got to tell you. Like I've gone through law school. I've got a good educational background. I've gotten elected as a politician, and now I'm on the inside. I'm like, whoa, this is not functional or particularly democratic or working effectively. Like, our political system has been hijacked by big business. And so we need to pay attention to that, and we need to strategize about ways to influence that system. But I think it's naive to trust that it's working effectively at the moment, because it's not.
Because when I was going through school, and we went to Parliament House, that's my excursion, and we learnt that the lawn or the grass on top of Parliament House was to sort of represent that the people are in charge.
Yeah.
So I've always gone into politics thinking that
and
these
I
people
love
represent
that idea.
us.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
like they represent me and you. So for them to be privileged, it's like I just don't understand it, because in a sense they're serving us, you know?
Although, interesting side note, like, as you say, Parliament House was designed with lawns on top so that people could walk over the top, and it's this egalitarian idea. But a couple of years ago, they actually fenced it all off. And you can't do that anymore because protesters kept gathering on top of Parliament House, and they were like, oh, we don't want this. And so now they've fenced off that area. Because I remember a few years ago, like,
that's what I loved about
it. And you roll down the grass, and you're like, I'm rolling down Parliament House. You can't do that anymore.
It's like I'm on top, you know what I mean?
They put up
Like,
these big fences because of security concerns. So, yeah.
I've been telling quite a few people about that.
I mean, it was true, but I think
fenced off now. That's
some good
quite indicative
video
of
footage.
like
I think that's kind of
where we're going, maybe
symbolic. Yeah.
Interesting. I wanted to draw your attention back to a post you made in 2017 about a banner, a new IPA beer that was a venue was advertising. The banner read, "Every day is Australia Day, Colonial IPA." You described that the word colonialisation should be understood as having the same gravity as words like Holocaust. And I definitely agree with you. I feel as though we organise language to suit a certain race. For instance, the word expat. The word expatriate, expat for short, comes from the Latin word ex, out of, and patria, which is fatherland. Expatriate is a legally working individual who resides temporarily in a country of which they are not a citizen, in order to accomplish a career-related goal, no matter the pay or the skill level. So you could consider a maid working in Dubai as an expat. Someone who has been relocated abroad either by organisation themselves or been directly employed by their host country. However, in reality, expat is a term reserved exclusively for Western white people going to walk abroad. Do you think that in order for us to change this sort of narrative, we need to start at the crux, which is language, which sort of is how we use to communicate, you know?
Yeah, big time. I think unless you have the vocabulary to describe an idea, it's hard for that idea to even exist or to be transmitted and shared. And that's a really good example of how, like, people of colour, people from formerly colonised nations are called migrants or migrant workers or immigrants. And then people from Western European nations are called expats. And it's totally arbitrary. It's one of the many examples of how language and vocab can be used to separate us or to disempower some and empower others and delegitimize some. And I think reclaiming certain terminology is really important. And that's like one of the reasons, because some people would be like, Jono, why do you care about what some beer ad says?
I can understand that.
But I think that language does matter, and how we talk about this stuff is important. And still in Australia, the term colonial for a lot of people has positive connotations. It's like, oh yeah, the colonial era, that was just like a period in Australia's history. But it's like, no, actually colonisation is an ongoing process of dispossession and oppression, and it's not something that we should celebrate or dismiss lightly.
Definitely not.
It's an
which
act
goes
of
back
violence.
to, like, I guess the beginning of our conversation, where our young people are not really educated in the system. So that word colonized, for you and I and perhaps a lot of other people, there's a lot of weight behind it. But maybe if you don't understand as much about the history and like the power of that word, you probably won't be as upset by when people put on a beer ad. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. So what is the Greens Party doing in terms of encouraging migrants and people who were born here to integrate? My mum founded the Eritrean Women's Association, and we often used to discuss how we didn't really like the word assimilate because we felt as though it's important to involve yourself in Australian culture and not necessarily just stick to the people that look like you. But don't lose your culture, you know what I mean?
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think that's been one of the problems with this assimilationist rhetoric that's become really common in Australia and a lot of sort of Western nations, is that this expectation that we already have the best culture and the best system, and all these migrants who come here have to just learn to be more like us. Whereas the idea of integration is like you retain your own sense of identity, you have your sort of own cultural connections, but you are still connected to other communities and other cultural groups. And but still the question becomes, what are we expecting people to integrate into? Yeah. And we're sort of saying to migrants, hey, you have to integrate into Australia. But we should also be saying, well, dominant white Australian culture needs to integrate with other cultures that we share. Like we never talk about what white Australians are doing to integrate better with First Nations cultures and languages. And we certainly don't talk about white Australians having to integrate into a more multicultural society. So again, right, language is really political. And
definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I think for the Greens, like there's some really obvious simple stuff. Like up in a couple of decades ago, any migrants or expats who came here, you were eligible for free adult English classes, and it was pretty easy to get high quality English teaching for free. These days, it's much less accessible. You know, the government will fund some conversation classes with random volunteers who are giving their time, but that's not the same as sort of, and so it's kind of like we might blame new migrants for being slow to learn English, but we're also not providing giving them the
any
support.
Services. Yeah,
and that's the same thing in so many areas in terms of understanding the legal system, in terms of understanding cultural norms. Like we get angry, say particularly at there's this sort of stereotype of young African men breaking the law or whatever, which is nonsense. It doesn't even stack up statistically.
But the Apex gang in Melbourne. Yeah,
but that stereotype is out there. But we don't actually provide much in the way of resources for new migrants to understand the legal system and understand how it's meant to work. But on top of that, the system functions very differently towards some people than others. So it's like we tell people to integrate into a system, but the system isn't designed to serve their needs or to accept them. And so it's like you'll never quite be Australian enough, and you'll never, you can tick all the boxes and speak the language and yeah.
But where are you really from?
Yeah, you'll still get that question, totally. And you'll never exactly. You'll never be fully Australian, quote unquote. And so that, I think, that idea of integration is kind of BS. But yeah, to answer your question, there's that really obvious stuff that like language classes and whatnot, but there's also, I think, needs to be a deeper shift in the Australian psyche around who's assimilating into what or who's integrating into what. And also
more of an integration than,
but also an understanding of like multiculturalism is not just weird food and ethnic dancing or whatever. Like multiculturalism means embracing the different ways that different cultures see and understand the world, and that richer idea of multiculturalism doesn't come through in the politicians' speech. They'll be like, oh, we're a multicultural country. What they're thinking of is that some people wear different clothes, or like that's not multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is
token photo of just one black.
Genuine multiculturalism is actually embracing, oh, you see the world differently, and that's cool, and we can learn from that. And I see the world this way, and we can learn from that. It's not just all these races in their sort of fixed in time stereotypes. And there's this, for anyone who's interested, look up the word polyculturalism, which is sort of a more contemporary critique of multiculturalism, which is more like all cultures are fluid, rather than saying, well, this is Tamil culture and we're going to draw lines around it and say you are Tamil, you're not because you don't do X, Y, Z. Polyculturalism is like recognizing that in different contexts, people will code shift and occupy different cultural identities. So in this space, I'm Tamil, but over in this space, I'm Australian, and I can have both of those identities and hold them simultaneously, which I think is a really interesting way of seeing things.
Did your dad have a sort of active part in the Tamil community here in Brisbane?
Not particularly, because when we were coming through, there were literally only like a handful of Tamils in Brizzy. And so... Like,
what year was that?
So, I mean, he sort of settled, or he married my mum around like 87, and I was born in 88. And he tells stories about how like one time he was at Chermside Shopping Centre and like 3 levels up, looking up the escalator shaft, they saw some other dark-skinned Indian dude. And so Dad like runs up 3 levels of the escalators just to go and talk to this guy and be like, oh, where are you from? Who are you? Because like it's so rare to see someone who wasn't white in Chermside in the 90s.
Ago too, so
but now you go to Chermside and it's super diverse. So
Jono, what is the future sort of hold for you? Are you thinking of staying in politics, or are you thinking of perhaps maybe putting your efforts into something else?
I mean, sometimes I daydream about quitting and just going back to being like a musician and like a writer. And I think I definitely don't want to be a career politician. When I got into it, I sort of said to myself, I'll do it for a couple of years. I'll see if it feels meaningful, and then I'll kind of reevaluate. And I've always sort of seen myself as an artist and an activist rather than wanting to be, a lifetime politician. So I think at some point, I'll probably move on to other things. But I think at the moment it still feels pretty effective and worthwhile. But I guess I also feel like a sense of urgency about the need for social change, because there's some pretty major issues we're dealing with. And sometimes as a local councillor, you end up getting bogged down in long discussions about dog off leash areas or like stormwater drainage. And you're like, no, we need to be talking about system change and bigger stuff. And so, maybe...
You would never sort of move into federal politics or...
A few people have asked me that, but I'm actually kind of skeptical of that as a immediate mechanism for change, because I think the further up the political system you go, the more you risk getting co-opted into those spaces. And like, you know, right now I'm a local councillor, I have about 45,000 people in my electorate, which is already a lot. If I became a federal politician, I'd probably have close to 150,000 people in my electorate who will all be emailing me and asking me for help with stuff and needing support with important issues. And meanwhile, I'm here trying to, change something over here that I think is important, but not necessarily everyone else thinks is as urgent. So I think sometimes what happens to people is that they become politicians thinking, I'm going to be able to change everything overnight, but they quickly realize that the role comes with its own expectations and responsibilities that and actually can be quite time consuming. So I'm lucky at the moment that I kind of have a big enough platform that I can get ideas out there and have some impact on public discourse and government policy. But I'm not so busy with other stuff that I think is less important that I get sucked into that world. And I guess my other criticism of sort of the federal political sphere is just you spend a lot of time in Canberra. You spend a lot of time surrounded by other sort of privileged people and members of the political establishment.
You become separated from the
you'll get detached. And I think that is a real risk. Even like Greens politicians, it can happen to them where they spend a lot of time in meetings with other politicians or like lobbyists or industry groups and a lot of time in Parliament and in Canberra that they actually don't have a good radar for what's going on the ground. And if you lose that, then you're not going to be able to reflect and represent those communities anyway.
No, definitely, for sure. Well, I wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today with Copy That. It was a pleasure to have you, and definitely be watching and with a keen eye of all the new things that are going to come out with the Greens Party.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to chat. Enjoyed it.
Yeah,
cool.
Thanks for coming.
See you later.
See you.